This episode of Reasonably Spontaneous Conversation is brought to you in part by Clay Boykin Life and Business Coaching, because we all get stuck at times. For more information, visit clayboykin.com. By Janelli Bean, for fun and engaging children's books with cute and colorful characters. For more information, visit janellibean.com. And by Wise Owl Organizing, simply set up for you. Organizing consulting and clarity coaching, virtual or in person. For more information, visit wiseowlorganizing.com.
Hello, world. It's me, Dennis, and I'm here with my friend, Frank Butterfield. Hello, Frank.
Hey, Dennis. How are you?
Well, I am following your path. Your path, I have said often, as I've said on the show, that to be a working artist, an artist who actually is able to take their art and to make a living on it, to make a living. On this outside sphere, there are those who happen to pop up, and make the multi-million dollars. And then there is the working artist, this idea of being able to be a working artist. And that's the sphere that I want to get. And that's the sphere that you have made. You have made it, and you're there. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
This is for the fans of Frank Butterfield, the ones who have been reading your books. You're so prolific, and you're also, take me back to the beginning of when you had the idea that you were going to be able to start writing, and you started. So let's go back to the year. Let's go back to the time, your mindset. What was going on?
Well, it happened in May of 2016.
Mm-hmm.
I had been writing kind of fanfic of sorts and wanted to publish it. And I showed it to some friends, and they were like, no, you can't publish that. And they were right. And so that night I went home and I sat down and I was just like, I want to write a book that will sell, a book I want to read and a book that will sell. And that's when, and the words just came to me, literally. And that's how it started. And I did the first book, and the people that I showed it to were like, oh, this is good. And I was like, great. And so then I published that after a little bit going back and forth. Then I did a second
How
book.
did you publish it? Before what was that process?
So prior to this, I had self-published some nonfiction, which sold fine, that sort of thing. I had all this background knowledge. So when I published it, I decided, well, I'm just going to do the fast and simple thing, which is use Amazon.
Mm-hmm. And they had already, at that time in 2016, they had set up all the background that would allow that to happen.
Right. So Kindle had been in play for, I don't know how many years, but for several years. So that was already set up, really easy to get into. And I had already done that. So the nonfiction stuff I did in 2012. So I was already familiar with the process.
Got it.
Right. So I already knew how it worked, and I got it assembled. And then because I wasn't doing hardcover at first or paperback, I was just doing ebook. It was actually a lot simpler than it had been when I did the first book, the nonfiction.
Got it.
So that took maybe, it seems like I remember sitting down at like 3 p.m, and then it was live by like 11 o'clock that night. And then I freaked out because I was able to buy a copy and I could see it, and I was reading it and rereading it, and I suddenly realized one particular thing, which the people who read my books will know exactly what I'm talking about, which is that I had referred to somebody, a person who had once been alive, who was now dead, in a very derogatory way, and actually made him kind of the villain of the story. And I suddenly was terrified that I was going to get sued. And then I had to like talk myself down the ledge by going in and realized, yes, you cannot libel the dead, to quote Agatha Christie. And so then I was like, okay, that's okay, I'm all set. So then the book just kind of went out organically. I let people that I was already connected to know about it, and then they told their friends, and then Amazon did its thing where it showcases off new authors in a way that I don't understand, but
Yes.
that's what happened. And then I started writing the second book.
Now
Pretty quickly.
you decided to write. This is a niche that you decided to write into. Talk about that. Talk about that and how you decided, because you have come up with an entire series of characters across many timelines, and that you're doing it for a particular audience. Talk about that.
So yes, you're right. So everything I write fiction is all in
Hmm.
the same universe, and there are multiple series and there are multiple timelines and locations.
Right.
The primary characters are Nick Williams and Carter Jones.
Hmm.
Nick is a private detective. Carter is a fireman who's kind of on leave, and that's how we start. And so, what
And
I'm
what is
writing, the
their
niche,
understanding? What is their understanding? These are gay men,
yeah,
and
they're in a
and and and
relationship.
and, and they're in a relationship. And
Mhm.
what is their relation to the world? How does the world think of gay relationships at the time that you are writing it?
Well, this is 1953 in San Francisco. At the time, being in a relationship wasn't illegal, but being caught in the act of sodomy was
Exactly.
illegal.
Exactly.
And but there wasn't a lot of enforcement, but it was
Mhm.
still illegal. However, San Francisco, 1953, it's 8 years after the end of World War II. San Francisco was probably the gayest city in North America at the time because
All
of
right.
all the sailors who had been discharged there at the end of the
This is
war.
the in the Castro, in that area, in
No,
that was it?
the
That
Castro
was
didn't
later.
exist yet.
Okay.
Right. So although they live in Eureka Valley, which is the old word for
Hmm.
the Castro,
Got it.
the main gay part of San Francisco at the time was the Tenderloin
Got it.
and a strip of Market
I've
Street
heard of that.
called the New
Okay.
Black.
Thank you.
Right.
So you were did you delve into the history of that time in order to begin to write about it so it would have some historical reality to it?
I did. So one of the very specific things I did was in the second chapter, Nick is a private detective. He has an office at a fake address, 777 Bush Street. It's a real place. If it existed, it would be what eventually became the Nob Hill Theater, which just closed. Um, but then he walks down to a real building, 100 Bush, which is called the Shell Building, to go visit his friend and ex-lover, Jeffrey Klein, who's a lawyer.
Mhm.
And his walk down Bush Street, he is thinking to himself about the different things he's seeing. In order to do that, I had to go to Polk's directory, the city directory, which is a thing that is kind of an old-fashioned thing that isn't done anymore, that basically would list a street and then list by the street number what all the different businesses were. So I knew what was there. I also used to live on Bush Street, so I already kind of had an idea of the feel for it, but I had to know exactly what was there. And then I mentioned some of the businesses, and it just kind of brings the
Oh,
reader into the
ex
ambience of the environment.
exactly, and that you've done your homework, because you know that when a reader will read and know that you've done your homework, because there're gonna be some people that are gonna know you're that's gonna give them a depth of level of that
Right,
you've actually spent time to be able to get this right.
right, right. So yeah, so the research is important. Now, I will say that there was one big, huge, gigantic mistake I made in that first book. The funeral at the end of the book is at Grace Cathedral, which is on Nob
Mhm.
Hill. And I describe Grace Cathedral as I remember its layout from when I lived there in the 90s.
Mhm.
But what I didn't know was that the cathedral was started in the 20s. It was halfway done when the stock market crashed in 29. And very wisely, the Episcopal Diocese decided we're not going to continue building. We want to use our money for other things. And so it sat there half done. And what it looks like when you look at a picture of it from like the 50s, it looks like a giant came along and cut that building in half and took one half of it away and just left the other half there. So there were still people that it was being used as a church. It was already the cathedral, but it wasn't complete. And so where the people would enter for that funeral would be a different street, and also what the building would look
Ah.
like. So I did go back later and change that, but that led to two different things. One is I got a lot more rigorous about my research, and it realized I cannot assume I know anything about anything, no matter what I think I know. So I double check and triple check. The other thing is that I found out about this because a reader contacted me and said, I hate to tell you that not only did you use the wrong nomenclature for the minister who's doing the funeral,
Sure.
the eulogy, you also have misdescribed the building. And he explained it to me. And then I was like, oh, this is awesome. Thank you so much. Would you like to read my books and help me? And he became one of my best beta readers. Unfortunately, he's passed away. But for about 10 books, 12 books, he just gave me some great feedback and insight, which was amazing.
All right. That's what I want to ask. All right. So here's the process. Let's go back to book 2. And you're starting to publish book 2. Are you getting a feel for these characters, for Nick, and getting a feel for them as to becoming real to you and beginning to tell their own stories? Did they tell their stories to you?
Oh yeah, no, I feel like all I'm just doing is writing down, because I write in first person narrative, which means Nick is thinking. So I did this and I said that.
Yep.
And no, I'm just writing down what he's telling me. That's the best way to put it.
Sure.
So, but there is a big change from book 1 to book 2. Book 2, they become more fleshed out. There's no question. Also, and I can't remember if it was book 2 or book 3 where I realized what I had done. But in book 1, one of my favorite literary characters is Lord Peter Wimsey, a Dorothy Sayers character from the 20s and 30s in England. And there's little bits of Lord Peter in the way Nick talks, which I didn't realize until I got to book 2. And then the way, so I was like, how do I solve this dilemma? And this has happened multiple times with multiple things. Then it just came to me that Carter would nudge him and say, okay, cut out your hi-hat talk. So the backstory reasoning is Nick grew up catty corner from Grace Cathedral on Nob Hill, the son of a very wealthy man. And when he was 16, got kicked out of the house and never really wanted to go back. And so he adopted his father later, many years later, describes the way he talks as like Sam Spade. Him, like, he tries to sound like Humphrey Bogart as Sam Spade, which would be right because that movie came out about the time, maybe like 17, 18.
Absolutely.
So that's the way I explained it, is that when Nick has to get his point across to somebody who's going to be impressed, he can do a hi-hat way of talking. But normally he just says, like when he answers the phone, he picks up and he says, yeah. He doesn't say hello. He just says, yeah. So I had a reader, probably I was about 6 or 7 books in, who sent me an email saying, when is Nick going to stop saying yeah? And I said, never. Because that's his personality.
It's just the way he is. All right. So now you're establishing a communication between the readers and you, and this particular audience. All right. Now, within a lot of the heterosexual literature, there is romance. Are these would this be classified within the genre of a detective and with a romantic part, or how do you frame this for your audience? What kind of feedback you're getting at this point?
Well, it's definitely gay mystery, which is its own genre.
So gay mystery. Got it.
Right. So, and there's already some established writers who I was reading back in the 90s, like Mark Zubro, who's actually someone who inspired kind of his original main characters, are Nick and Carter are somewhat like him or like them. But yeah, so fast forward a few books, and there is every year a romance convention here in Daytona Beach, which is where I live. And I decided, well, I wanted to go check it out. And I met all these wonderful authors who write gay romance, mostly women. And I was trying to see if I could shoehorn my stuff into that. And it didn't work because I talked to some really wonderful people, very smart, very knowledgeable. And they said, no, this isn't really romance. And I was like, that's right, because I'm not really writing a romance, although I have written romances, there's no question. But the story of Nick and Carter, for example, is a long form romance. They meet in 1947, they die in 2008.
Yep.
And they're together that entire time, except for a couple.
They're a relationship. They're in a
Oh
relationship.
yeah, they're a committed marriage. And
Yep.
in fact, in book 2, they start using the word husband to refer to each other, which freaks lots of people out.
Wow. Of course it would.
When they, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's no legal basis for it, but they're like, but that's what we are. That's what we're doing.
Your spouses.
Yeah. So, one thing we haven't talked about, which I think is kind of important, is when I talked about earlier, the villain in the first book,
Mm-hmm.
the villain in the first book was George Hearst, the oldest son of William Randolph Hearst. So the Hearsts, who are kind of, William Randolph Hearst is essentially Charles Foster Kane, but not really.
Exactly. That was he was based on that from
Right.
Citizen Kane.
From Citizen Kane, exactly. But really, the more I've written about Hearst, the more I've realized actually Kane and Hearst are not really the same person.
Mm-hmm.
But
just
they're
the mythology
right.
of Hearst rather than the actuality of Hearst.
Right. So Hearst died in 51 or 52, and he had this very complex will, which I won't get into. But essentially, in 53, George Hearst was more or less running the San Francisco Examiner, which was the flagship of the Hearst papers.
Totally.
And it was also just 2 steps above a tabloid. And if you go back and read those articles from those years, the 50s in particular, they're just really, there's lots of unsigned articles and editorials in the middle of stories. And it's,
I thought that I really thought that they were like the Gray Lady, very, very hard journalism. No, it wasn't. Wow.
No, that's the Chronicle. The Chronicle was
the Chronicle was that way.
Like
this is the Examiner. Okay, now thank you.
So what happens, the critical moment of the entire series, of this entire universe, is towards the end of the first book, The Unexpected Heiress. Nick and Carter take 2 friends of theirs to go have dinner at the top of the Mark, and that's also not right. You can theoretically eat at the top of the Mark, but I make it into a full restaurant for the duration of all of these.
This is your universe.
Yeah.
You get to populate this universe, and as long as the reader can have enough of a credibility, they can go along with your timelines. Right. What happens on this timeline is not the same as happens on this timeline.
Exactly. Well, and in fact, the Mark Hopkins, which is where the top of the Mark is so integral. Nick ends up owning it, and in fact, ends up having a chain of hotels called the Hopkins Hotels that are named after it.
Oh, cool.
That goes on down the line. But anyway, so in this one instance in 1953, they're having dinner at the top of the Mark, and they have, because Nick is a really famous big tipper, and everybody in town knows this. He's a millionaire.
Sure.
And they are having dinner, and he had handed the maitre d' a $100 bill to get a table in the window.
Back when $100 was a lot of
money. And so in doing so, they displaced George Hearst and his wife, and Randolph Hearst and Catherine Hearst. And Randolph and Catherine are Patty's parents. Now, when I wrote this little thing, I was like, one day I will meet Patty Hearst, and I will be able to tell her I said very nice things about your parents. And so every time they show up, I'm always like, how wonderful they are. Because actually everything I've ever heard, that is actually the way they are.
Sure.
George, however, was not that way. And that's well known. Yeah. So anyway, in this event, what happens is they're sitting next to the Hearsts are sitting here, and Nick and Carter and their friends are sitting here. And George Hearst starts making these kind of snide comments that everybody can hear. And finally, Nick stands up and basically is like, look, because what George Hearst says is like, ever since the war, this town has just turned into it's just become this horrible place because all these, blankety blanks, all these gays are here.
And Nick use pejorative terms so that it does have that kind of reality. So we do get a chance to see the bigotry. We do get a chance to see the world as it was during that time, even though we're in San Francisco.
Exactly. And there was just, just as much bigotry there as anywhere else. Although Nick does have some insight into that as things go on, and he goes to Georgia, for example. Mm-hmm. Like just a few months after this instance, and gets confronted with some very hardcore bigotry.
Wow.
But so they're saying that, and Nick finally just tells them off, and it's like, San Francisco, San Francisco has always been a whore of a city, which I agree with, because
A
San
great,
Francisco has,
yeah,
San Francisco was never a town; it's always been a city, and it
yes.
started up with it became what it is now because of the 49ers and because of the gold rush, and that's where Nick's money comes from. So he
Yeah,
basically tells off George Hurst
beautiful.
and stomps off to the bar, and Carter follows him and catches him before he gets to the bar and turns him around and kisses him in the middle of this restaurant with all these people watching. So nothing happens to them at that moment. But then when they all leave, they go down the elevator, and as the door opens, there's all these press and all these cameras, and they get their picture taken, and they're spread across like all over the country as being like the man who told off George Hurst.
Yes.
And that becomes, so what essentially is happening is Nick and Carter, um, 13 or 23 years before Harvey Milk, is the first openly gay man, or they're the first openly gay men that are known nationally. There are other openly gay men already. That's
Of
already happened,
course.
but they're known within a circle or within like
Right.
literature, within a
Yeah,
context.
exactly.
This is like
All of the New York Greenwich Village, all
yeah,
the different places that they have. Yeah, absolutely.
right. So Nick and Carter end up being outed, and because Nick has money, essentially all of his friends lose their jobs. They all work for they're firemen and policemen, and they all lose
Sure.
their job. But then that gives Nick the opportunity to start a new company, which is what everything then begins to flower out of. Um, and so they kind of end up building a parallel place where they can do what they need to do and be safe, and they're protected by his money and that sort of thing. So it gives an opportunity. It doesn't change history, which is like I had someone ask me one time, what would Harry Hay, who was an activist in the 50s, who
Hmm.
founded the Mattachine Society, was one of the founders, and also
Yes.
was just a big activist until he died in the 90s. Um, what would Harry Hay think of Nick? And I was like, oh, he would hate him because Nick is a millionaire and Harry Hay was a communist. And so like he would have found it to be very like, and so I built that into some of the stories. Like when Nick kind of encounters the Mattachine Society, which is an early gay rights group,
Sure.
they keep him at arm's length. They don't want anything to do with him. And that generally every time he encounters someone who we know historically, they tend to keep him at a distance, because until Harvey Milk comes around, being associated with Nick, if you're gay, means that you're going to be outed.
That's right.
And so that kind of further solidifies this kind of cocoon that they live in and well into the 70s.
All right. All right. Now, here's the thing that I want to know, because actually I have about 40 hours that I could continue on this conversation, but I want us, this is going to be the seed of what we're doing. All right, are you beginning to see sales? Are you beginning to see the economic process of building yourself as Frank Butterfield author, and beginning to see this now in like book 6 or 7, or is it starting to momentum? Are you starting to build that audience? How did that happen?
Oh yeah, no, it started off immediately, and I didn't do anything. I just kept writing and publishing. And what I discovered later is that most people will say that is actually the way to do it, is just bring out book after book after book after book. And I got to the point where I could do a book a month.
Yeah.
For 3 years, I've been working on 3 books a month, which I've accomplished 3 stories in a month, but I haven't been able to do 3 books. Um, and in fact, the recent unpleasantness has kind of like caused me to kind of have to rethink how I was doing my work. But yeah, no. So the sales started almost immediately.
Yeah.
I didn't really do anything. I just put it out there.
Oh,
Um,
wonderful. And so all right, now did you decide to to within your particular series go from a light romance to some that have hardcore scenes in it? Did you have to decide that? What was
well,
the thought process there?
it's all contextual to when the story is set. So
Yes.
I have a contemporary series where there's been increasingly more conversation about actual explicit sex and also just wild stuff on the side,
Sure.
which makes sense because it's set, contemporaneously.
There were actual bath houses. There were
Oh, but
actual.
we haven't really got there yet. So
Yeah.
here's the thing: Nick and Carter Nick was born in 22, Carter was born in 20.
Right.
So when the 60s roll around, they're in their 40s. They're also a couple, and
Got
they're
it.
well established.
Are they
So
monogamous?
oh yeah.
Okay.
And they're not going to bathhouses, but they know people who are going to bathhouses, like Nick's ex, Mike, who runs the security division of their
Mhm.
company. Mike and his husband Greg, they go to the baths, they go to all the bars. They're the ones who are out doing all the stuff
Right.
like that. And so Nick and Carter hear about it kind of from the side.
Exactly.
And then, of course, they hear about it from their employees. But so what's happened is I ended the first series called the Nick Williams Mysteries with book 32, which was
Mhm.
February of 67. Nick and Carter then, because of a traumatic event, go to Kauai. They have a house there. And they stay there until the Princeville development, because they live right above where Princeville is, until the Princeville development starts. And then they realize it's getting too noisy because they lived basically in the middle of nowhere until all that started. So they end up going back to San Francisco. And that's the beginning of a new series called The Adventures of Nick and Carter, because I didn't want to shoehorn everything into mysteries. I wanted to have a little bit more room to play with stories.
Yeah.
So I'm working on book 5 of that series. And what's happened, because we went from 67 to 70, also, they missed the Summer of Love. They missed because they were in Hawaii. They weren't there for any of that, which I
Wow.
intentionally did because I was like, I don't think I would be very good at writing about it.
Mhm.
But what has happened is in this new series, it's a lot more explicit, a lot more explicit because it's the 70s. So
Right.
I wrote,
It was pre-AIDS,
yeah,
so it
right,
was
and there's
pre-AIDS,
liberation,
and there's gay liberation. There's a lot. I mean, people really flew their freak flag both all across
right,
the attraction spectrum.
right, exactly, which had all sorts of interesting effects and
Sure.
causalities and whatnot. So I've written a bunch of short stories during the recent unpleasantness. I wrote a bunch of short stories that went through a year. So starting with New Year's Day and ending with Boxing Day. And I wrote 24 short stories that encompass, and they're in different time periods. So like New Year's Day is January of 79.
Mhm.
Boxing Day is 1986. Oh
Mhm.
no, I'm sorry, is 81. But there's like a story at Easter where Carter is like a kid and it's
Sure.
1929 and things like that. But so my first story was January 1, 1979. It was a short story set in Dallas, one of the Hopkins hotels. Nick and Carter have it's the Lowe's Atoll that
Mhm.
on Stemmons, but they own it. So there's a big, huge fundraising party. But that, if you remember that year, that was the year that it froze in Dallas,
Yeah.
and they played the Cotton Bowl on ice. Essentially, the Cotton Bowl happened, and that was there was a very famous USC was one of the teams, and there was a very famous quarterback. That
Mhm.
was his last game to play before he went to the NFL.
Yeah.
And it was this anyway. So everything is frozen. There's a murder that happens at this hotel at the party, and cops can't get there. Meanwhile, Nick Carter walking around. Carter's the center of attention because he's the most handsome man in the world, and
Of
everybody
course.
always wants to like dance with him. And Nick is like always off on the sidelines watching. And but mostly in the subtext, there is cocaine everywhere because it's Dallas in 1979 in the gay
That
community with cocaine everywhere.
everywhere.
So some people got offended by that. And I was like, well, it's okay that you're offended. It's just this is the reality, and this is what I'm writing about. Which brings me to what I think is a very important point. Nick and Carter are extraordinary and are anachronistic, and they just didn't happen. Nobody like that has existed. But what I wanted was to write this fantastical story within a heavily historical context, to make it as authentic and real within the context of the reality they've created, the world they're living in, to bring it fully into the actual world. So that, like I said, they don't change history ever. They're always on the periphery of different things watching it. But when I'm talking about what's actually happening, I never change. I try to make it as real as I possibly can. And in that story, it was snowing outside and it was snowing inside. That's all I
Oh,
can say.
well, this and I love the pride section on on your website, and I love the historic and the pictures that you're bringing in. I mean, there's so much that you're speaking about. Okay, right now, while I'm talking to you, Frank, I'm also talking to the friends and the fans of Frank Butterfield. I'm talking to you now, all you viewers, all you listeners who are doing this. I want you to please contact Frank or contact me as to what questions have I not asked that Frank Butterfield you want him to answer. You write me, you write Frank, and then we're going to have another one of these. I'm going to drag Frank back up on the screen and we're going to answer the questions that you want. I'm going to put them up there. We're going to do it, and we're going to make sure that we have the conversations about the things that you want to hear about. So I know I sprung that on you, Frank, but that's something that I think that would be just absolutely wonderful for me and wonderful for the fans of Frank Butterfield.
I think that's awesome. Yay.
Jay.
Can't wait.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and thank you for giving us an opportunity. Frank, thank you. Our friendship spans decades, and the fact of being able to see you, we visited you out in when we went out to Fort Lauderdale and the Florida. I want to talk with you about so much, including what's going on in Florida and with all the current climate and the opportunities and the creativity. But anyway, we're going to stick with that. The fans of Frank Butterfield, write Frank, write me, and we'll see you next time.